Hello, welcome to my studio. Today's Tuesday tip is all about art. Let's get right in it. Brushes. Let's get right in it. Brushes come in many different styles, forms, and I'm going to go over all of the different brush types with you today. So the reason why this would be a tip is because, for one, I'm teaching you all about these brushes, but I'm also going to tell you how you can use them in your art. I'm going to start with my Sumi brushes. Now my Sumi brushes I typically keep in my bamboo sheet here. They just go in here and then they roll up inside of it. Now with our Sumi brushes, there's a couple little things that you can use in Sumi art that wouldn't technically be a brush, but I'm going to include them anyway. One is a little dowel rod. As you can see here, it is angled. And I have it angled off and flat at the top. And I kind of use this a little bit like a pin. Now, what works even better than that is a bamboo pin. There is literally nothing inside of it. It's just a hollow bamboo stick that has been cut and edged and split right here. You can see the line right there in between the two dark spots, and that split paired with a hole right there allows it to work kind of like a calligraphy pen. And you put it in your ink and it soaks up, and then you just use it like you would a calligraphy pen. Sumi brushes are made out of wolf hair. That is what they are called, wolf hair brushes. But they're not actually made from wolves, and let me explain why. They are made from animals that I will list on the screen right now. The Chinese character for that animal all ends in wolf. That's why it is called wolf hair. So instead of saying specifically the animal type that was used to make this, they just say that they're wolf hair brushes. These come in many different sizes and shapes. You have ones that can be very skinny and sharp tipped, and you can have really wide ones that don't have a tip to them. And then you can have these really wide ones for really broad strokes. I'll have a future video where I go over Sumi art specifically, but just a brief explanation of this is traditional Sumi paint is more like inky watercolors. If you've seen really old traditional style Chinese paintings, they were made with these type of brushes. And what's interesting is this really wide one, whenever you stick it in the ink, because of the viscosity and consistency of the ink, it doesn't quite behave the same way as acrylic would or oils. When you load this brush up, it will form a little bit of a tip, so it won't stay this wide necessarily, because the ink will weigh it down and kind of form a tip, but it will not be the same as this. This will still be pretty broad. Now this one will definitely stay wide because of how it's made with 3 different ones fused together. This will stay wide because it doesn't have the opportunity to come to a point, because even as I'm pushing these together, it's still not a point like a small one would be. Now, just as the range from very fine, small to wide, there are ones in between, and they can have fine points as well, even though they're bigger, or they can have more of a softer edge to them. And depending on what you're painting will determine what brush you use, obviously. So if you were painting a fish, you might want to use something like this or this, and then you would go in with the details of the fish with a pointed one like this one or this one. If you were doing mountains or type of landscape, you might want to go with one of these type of brushes. I'm now going to go over these brushes. These are actually makeup brushes, and the reason why I like to use makeup brushes is because they have kind of a different density. They are made to be softer because they're made to be on your face. They aren't made to be as rigid or stiff as an acrylic or an oil paintbrush would. This isn't boar bristles, and this isn't nylon, really stiff nylon. This is probably a really softer nylon. I'm not quite sure actually what this is made of, but I do know that it's softer, and that softness helps with blending edges. For instance, whenever I was painting this, I made the mistake of grabbing one of these brushes instead of one of these, and you can see that this is soft and this has some edges to it, see? Now, whenever I was dabbing on my leaves, they just came out as really soft little puffs. This is what I needed to have the leaves stick out, because I want all of these different bits create a little dot. So one little boop of this creates many dots, whereas this just made it a soft little fluff. So you can use this in your acrylic paintings and your oil paintings to soften some edges, or if you have a painting where there's a light source coming through somewhere and you add a little bit of color and then use this to rub it out so that it is showing some light being diffused out. This would be a good brush to use for that. You can also use them in your charcoal, your pastels, and your pencil, your graphite work, because for the same reason, you can use this to soften and rub out any of the shadows that you are making with those. With the pastels, this would be kind of nice to lighten the color, because with your pastels, as you use the brush, it's going to take the pastel color off, and so it's going to lighten it up instead of blending it necessarily. With an acrylic, it's going to blend, and with a charcoal, it's going to soften and add shadows. And with watercolor, it's just going to just put the color on. It's not necessarily going to blend, because that's not how watercolor really works. Now, I showed this one a lot whenever I was talking because it's nice and big and it really helps with those shadows, but there are really small ones that can get the job done as well. And let's say you're using a pastel and you are trying to lighten a particular spot. You would want to use one that is thin, and you can really get in there and make a line, and it's going to kind of rub off that pastel, and it's going to create this line where it's kind of pulled the color off, so it's not as intense, but the color's still going to be there. It's just not going to be as bright, and there's obviously going to be a huge difference between what you have had thick pastel on and where you've just marked with one of these. Now, with acrylic, if you needed to blend a very, very small spot, obviously you would use one of these brushes instead of a bigger one. Hey, are you liking this video? Then like this video. And if you want to hear more writing and art tips, then please hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit the notification icon so that you don't miss an episode. All right, let's get back in it. I'm now going to go over these brushes. These brushes are two different nylons. Now, this nylon it's soft because it feels soft to the touch, but it actually is very firm and holds its shape really well. Now, these nylons are very loose in nature, so they're very bendy, and they're also really small. And the reason why I have my brushes in the containers that I do helps divide them in how I paint and how I work. These are in like categories. So these are my nylons. Side is obviously my longer nylon brushes, which there's a time and place to have a longer brush as well, and having a smaller brush to really get in there with the detail. Now this brush is really thin and skinny. The skinniest one I have of this is skinny, but not quite as much. So this one I can go in and put in some really fine detail, but keep in mind when you're using a nylon that is very bendy and moves very easily, when you're trying to put in a detail, that might affect the type of detail that you're putting in. So again, there's a time and place for every type of brush, whether it is an old brush, a new brush, a brush that's torn up, and a brush that's really well taken care of. There is a time and place for all of them, I promise. Something interesting about these brushes in particular is that they have little balls off the end of them. They're just little metal balls at the end, and I like to use these for adding detail where, say you're making an eyeball and you need just a little dot for the highlight in their eye, and you just get a little bit of white on this and just poke it and you're done. Whereas having to get a brush and you're trying to hold very still so that you don't accidentally make a line instead of a dot, this makes it a lot easier. And there's so many other reasons why you would need to use something for little detail, because it's the details that really make your painting pop. And depending on how realistic you want your painting to be, the more details you add, the more realistic it's going to become. And even when you're doing something abstract, you can have a very detailed abstract painting, and it's these little things that an artist can painstakingly go through and add all of these finite little details that make up the whole painting. And someone who might have an untrained eye might not see all those little details, but the artist definitely knows, and they appreciate it when other people see it, I think. So I can't speak for everybody, but I think it's cool when someone can appreciate a piece of art and they're like, oh, do you see that tiny, tiny bit of paint right there that just accents and highlights that section? And you're like, oh my gosh, that's totally true. Cool. I'm going to be going over these brushes. These brushes are in my category of very small. Not necessarily small in length, but small in size. I think the biggest one that I have here would be this one right here, compared to my smallest brush that I have in here. It's kind of hard to even see the tip of it. See, these are my detail brushes, and like I've said, there's a time and place for every type of brush. So whenever I'm needing to make a dab, but I need the dab to be fanned out, this old brush is perfect because it is tried and true. I know that whenever I load the brush up with this, it's not going to make this brush smooth. There's sometimes whenever you add acrylic or you load up a brush, and what I mean by loading up a brush is you're sitting there with the paint and you're loading up the bristles so that they get the paint down on the inside so that you can paint more, because there's more paint inside of your bristles. Now, like I said, whenever you add acrylic or oils to a brush that you've loaded up, sometimes it makes it softer and it creates a point or an edge. Depending on how you're loading it up, you can have a flat edge or you can have a point. I know that when I load this one up, it's still going to keep its shape because it's old and its bristles are old, that they're not going to tighten together. They're going to stay kind of wide like this. And I can make dabs that aren't going to be soft little dabs. And because it's not a super tiny finite brush, it's going to be obviously a bigger dab. But because this one is more wide, the dab that I make with this is going to be kind of a line. That's something to keep in mind as well. It's a brush like this that it was designed to be a wide flat brush, but because it's been so well used, and even though it is technically clean right now, it is stained with past paint and it is stuck in the shape that it is. I know that, see how it's kind of turned into a circle? I know that even though this was made to be a flat brush, whenever I make a dab, it is going to be more round. Something to keep in mind with your long skinny brushes, and I don't mean long down here, I mean long up here. If you can see the difference here, this one keeps its shape really well. This one is very, see how that one doesn't really move, it keeps its shape. This one, it moves very easily. So whenever you are drawing a line, keep in mind that because this one is softer and you're dragging it, it's going to move very fluidly, whereas this one is going to keep its shape and just make a straight line and give you no fuss. This one's not going to give you fuss either, but keep in mind if you're wanting to do a line that has a curve, this one is going to work better for you because it's going to accommodate the curve you're trying to make because it's a softer brush. Whereas this one, if you try to do an angle wherever, if you're painting more on the side like this, it's not going to go quite as easily. Now, if you were painting like this and you made some loops, keep in mind, do you see how the end of the brush kind of fans out a little bit? That's something to keep in mind as well as you're picking your brush, because if you are making loops, I mean, you can lighten your pressure and you're just doing a little bit, but this is a firm brush, but the end of these move very easily with pressure. This one, it's going to do a little burnt. See how that goes? This one kind of came to the, it angled, like went to the side. This one, when you go to dab to make a line, it fans out. A teeny tiny brush like this, whenever you go to make a line, it's probably not going to work as easily for you because there's not very many bristles here. The less amount of bristles means the less amount of paint you're going to be able to load up into these bristles. So if you're trying to make a really long line, this one's not going to be your friend because you're not going to be able to make a very long line because there's not going to be as much paint here. It's going to end up frustrating you. If you wanted to make a line or a swoop that was very clear, clean, and kept its shape, you would want something like this. It is a nylon brush that is going to keep its shape pretty well for you. This one would be really good for dots or adding the little teeny tiny details. If you're wanting to make a really long line where something keeps its shape, you're going to want a sturdier nylon brush, and depending on the thickness of the line that you want, not only determines how much pressure you add, but also the size as well. So you can get a really sturdy nylon brush and you can get different sizes. So this one is particularly a round nylon brush, and this is a flat, wide angled brush. So you can have a fat, wide mark, or you can turn it to the side and have a thin one. And these are going to be your good bets for making lines. When you're using this one, you just have this point to make the line. Whereas when you use a flat brush, you have all of this to help aid in your line. It's not just a point. You have paint that's loaded up from the beginning of where your brush is touching to the back end as well. So as you're making a line, you're having the bristles follow in a line, which helps add paint, whereas a pointed brush like this, you might have to keep re-dabbing and re-going, even though you've loaded up your brush a whole lot. I have a brush here that I have used a lot, and I have cleaned it so many times that the bristles have actually broken off. And so it's really odd shaped, and it's really, really hard to show. But can you see how there's a point there, but as I'm twisting it, you can see how it's almost angled. So it's like a mountain almost. It's shorter right here, it gets a little taller there, and then it gets taller over here. So this odd little brush I like to use whenever I am dabbing a detail. It doesn't work so much for lines or figures, but it is very, very firm, so I know that whatever I poke is going to keep its shape. And if I were to use it to add to a rounded detail, it's going to stay right around the edge just like I need it to. Whereas a longer brush, if you're adding a detail, say you've got a curve and you're adding a detail to that curve, because this brush is so bendy and flexible, it might be disobedient and just pop out depending on it, because you have to hold your pressure, right? And if you accidentally just naturally move your hand, even just microly, you can pop the bristles and it might not keep that clean edge. Again, you might be thinking I'm referring mostly to extremely detailed paintings that are hyper realistic or realistic in nature, but even with an abstract, you can have a lot of detail with your abstracts as well. And even impressionist art. What's so interesting about abstract and impressionistic art is that you can tell what they've painted when they haven't gone into hyper realism, and they use brushes like these to add those tiny little globs. Because if you look at impressionistic artwork, it's like when you get really close to it, they're just globs. They're just globs. And they've used brushes like this, small brushes that can go in and make a glob in just the right spot that whenever you pull out, you see the painting and you see how detailed it is. And you're just like, wow, how'd they do that? And you lean in and you're like, oh, it's just globs. I just find that so fascinating. Next, I'm talking about these brushes. These brushes are comically in my smallest vessel, but a tip inside of a tip for you, how I keep my brushes able to stay right where I put them. Rice and beans. Now these brushes, this is a bristle brush that is really rough, but you know what? It's perfect for adding the details to trees, grass, bushes, and even flowers. This brush I've had for quite some time. I got in college because in my college class, all we were asked to get were these nylon soft grip brushes. And this one has developed a little bit of a curve, and you can see how this one that I've showcased a few times, it's not quite the same as it was when I first bought it. These two are actually brothers. This one's a little bit longer, and the reason why he had us get such long brushes is because we were practicing with painting with our arms out, and sometimes people paint, we're like, here's their painting, and they're doing this. He wanted us to practice adding our details with a long brush away from us, because he wanted to give us the muscle memory of using our body to be able to add the different details and lines of whatever we were painting. And there were times where we had to use a brush like this, actually, instead of a smaller one, because he didn't want us to be so worried about the tiny details and just get the paint on there. You're looking at what you're wanting to paint, you're looking at your study, and you're like, okay, so there's about this much of that color right there. Then you go to your canvas and you put on that paint, instead of trying to be perfect and be like, oh, it has to be a certain shape and size. It's just getting your paint on there. These brushes are actually in the same category as these ones to me. These ones are really big for putting down your colors, like I was just saying. And these ones are as well. They're not quite as big, but they're also not quite as small. And the length of the brush is nice to be able to do your painting, whether it's a portrait or abstract, landscape, whatever you're doing. Sometimes it's nice to be able to just sit back and add your paint. Whenever you pull in close to your painting, you're seeing all of the globs, you're seeing all of the little things, and sometimes it's nice to sit back and go, oh, okay, this actually looks better than I thought. Because sometimes when you're a little too close to your painting, just like in life, sometimes when you're a little too close to the problem, you need to step back to take some perspective. And a brush that's long like this helps you sit back and get some perspective. Sometimes it's nice to just get the paint on the canvas, and these ones are really nice to make lines on your painting whenever you're trying to map something out, and it's going to keep its shape. It's soft, but it's going to keep its shape really well, because I've noticed that there's a little bit of a difference between a soft that keeps its shape and a soft that moves too much when you didn't want it to. For instance, this type of soft is going to be too bendy depending on what you're wanting, whereas this is a type of soft that, and not that that was bad, but this might be a type of soft that better suits your fancy. Oh. Now, to further explain how these brushes can work, I'm going to pick a few brushes from each category, and I'm going to make a dot and a line to showcase them to you. I do want to showcase to you the makeup of a brush. So you have 3 components of a brush. You have the handle, the metal piece that combines both the bristles and the handle, but then you also have the bristles. The metal piece here helps keep the integrity of the shape that was intended, while also creating a spot for the handle to be attached to the bristles, because the bristles aren't usually attached to the brush itself. I'm going to showcase the brushes to you in order of how I showed them to you at the beginning of this video. All of the brushes are going to be demonstrated with acrylic, except for the sumi. That is going to be shown to you with the ink. Starting with the smallest brush, we have a line, a thick line, a soft dot, and a hard dot. You can see that with the sumi brush, because of the nature of what the bristles are made out of, when you make a hard dot, it doesn't keep a rounded shape. A little bit bigger one. This is what it looks like whenever it's loaded up. So Here is a thin line, thick line. Now turned to its side, here is a soft way, a hard way, a soft dot, and a hard dot. You can see here that the same effect happens with the dot. Now the larger, and as I've said, whenever you load one of these brushes up, it can come to a point, and you see how it's a nice curve point. There is a way to keep it from having that point, and you just simply dab it several times. And you might need to use your hands a little bit too. Kind of fan it out so that it's not a point, but it's not going to give you an edge that is similar to this one. Soft line looks like a medium-sized line, and then an even thicker line. You can see that I actually had some pretty good control because the thickness of the brush helps it keep its shape even as I'm pressing. Here's a dot, and here's a harder dot. Now I'm going to do the wide. Here you can see that even though I have loaded up the brush just a little bit, it has not come to a point like this one did. There are points, but not one in particular. So from the side, here is a soft line, a hard line, and an even harder line. Now with these bigger brushes, I did a third type of line because it's with these bigger brushes that are easier to do bigger, thicker brush strokes than the skinnier ones. Now here it is from the side. Soft one, a hard one, and an even harder one. Now, if this was completely loaded up all the way back here, these lines would look very different. But I'm showing you what it looks like when just a little bit of this brush in particular is loaded up. You see how you get these lines from these. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like when this is completely loaded up, but not before I do a soft dot and a hard dot. This one has been loaded up much more than it was the first time, and I'm going to show you what that looks like now. So from the side, here is a thin line, a medium pressed line, and a harder pressed line. From the side, here is a soft line, harder line, and an even harder line. You see how that brushes it took out all my other strokes. Here's a soft dot, and here's a hard dot. The broader strokes started to blend, but you can clearly see how this looks much different than this does. And depending on what you're wanting to paint, there's a time and place for this type of stroke with this brush and this type of stroke with the same brush. Moving on from the Sumi, we are going to be working on these makeup brushes. Here is a soft thin line. Here is a harder line, soft dot, and a hard dot. You can see with this brush type in particular, it did hold paint really well for about an inch, and then slowly started to taper off on this thicker line. Whereas this one, I was too light and I accidentally did some jumpy bits where there wasn't any paint. But you can see that you can get a really nice thin line with a brush just like this. Now with this bigger brush of the same type, here is a thin line, and here is a thicker line. You can see how it starts to taper off here at the end. Here is a soft dot, and here is a hard dot. To this style of brush, I have one that's a little bit more fanned out, probably more from use than how it was intended to be made, and then I have a skinnier one here. Here is a soft line, and here is a hard line. A soft dot and a hard dot on the side, and here's a hard dot from the top. Now you can see with this one, it's the same a little bit with these type of brushes. It did have really good color consistency right at the beginning, but tapered out very quickly. The small dot that was done very lightly created a very nice circle, whereas the harder dots got a bit more blobby. Here is a soft line. Here is a hard line. Here is a soft dot, a medium dot, and a hard dot. And don't forget, this one was the one I showed you that had a ball at the end. I think these are actually supposed to be for nails, but I thought they would be really useful for painting. But here is a dot with that. They're very similar, and specifically the dot made with the metal end was a lot more symmetrical than the dots with the brushes. On to these soft nylons that I have. I'm going to start with this rounded one. Now I can get a really nice point with this. So here is a soft line, a hard line, a soft dot, and a hard dot. I'm also going to show you what this looks like when you brush from the side of it. So here is a soft line. Here is a hard line. A dab from the side, that's a soft dot, that is a hard dot. I'm now going to be showing you this flat brush, but first we're going to be going from the side. There's a thin line, a hard line, a soft dot, and a hard dot. Obviously with this type of brush, a dot is going to be more like a line. So let me show you what it looks like from this angle now. That's a soft line. This is a hard line. That's a soft dot. That's a hard dot. I want you to keep in mind some consistencies with all of these brushes that I've shown you so far. At the beginning, the brush holds its color really, really well, whereas the farther you drag, the less paint that you have. And that is extremely common. It's the inks that tend to hold their color a little bit longer, but that's just because of the consistency of the ink. Watercolor would behave about the same way. It's the acrylics that tend to have this kind of effect here. And you see with this brush in particular, these were the makeup brushes, have like a fanned out feel to them, whereas these ones end off on a brush stroke, whereas this seems more of a soft blend out, like a fade, where this doesn't fade as much and it's more of a hard pointed end, and you can tell that that's a brush stroke. I have one more of that kind to show you, and that is the skinnier kind of this one that I demonstrated. And I have a good angle on that. There is a soft line, a hard line, a soft dot, and a hard dot. I'm going to show you what that looks like going from the side versus the top. There is a soft line. There is a hard line. There's a soft dot, and there's a hard dot. I'm now going to move on to the fourth section of brushes that I showed you originally. if you remember, these ones were my category of really small ones. It doesn't matter if they're old, doesn't matter if they're new, if they're small, they get lumped into this category for me personally. Starting with the baby here, remember I said that you can't load this one up too much because it can get really chunky, and let me show you what I mean about that, because that is just a glob. Not that that's wrong, there's a time and a place, but with this particular type of brush is meant for small details. And again, because you can't load it up too much, you're not going to have much of a drag with this one. So here is a small line, a hard line, soft dot, and a hard dot. You can see that there's not too much of a difference between the soft and the hard line because that brush is so small. Honestly, I could have an even smaller type of line, but you're only going to get a certain size of line. That's as big as it's going to get. And the dots could get even smaller as well, but for the purpose of the video, I want you to be able to see the dot very clearly. So even though these are the smaller dots, they can get smaller. I'm going to show one that is slightly bigger. Now this is one of my softer but firm ones. There's a small line with that, hard line, small dot, big dot. This is the same brush as the other one, except this is more of the looser bristles than its brother was that I just showed here. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. Here's a soft line, a hard line, soft dot, and a hard dot. Now if you notice with this one, the line got a little bit more even as I dragged out. What I've noticed with the brushes that are looser and not as firm in shape, at the beginning their strokes tend to be thicker than at the end where they get thinner, and and this is actually what I'm going for when I'm using that type of brush. Not so much the part right here, but this is the part that I'm going for when I'm using that style of brush. This brush is a round brush. It is small and it's a soft bristle brush. This type of brush I've never been able to get to a fine point, but that's okay. Here is a soft line. Here's a hard line. Here's a soft dot. Here's a hard dot. You can see here with this one in particular, the brush started to bow out, and that's why we have like this croissant shape. Now this is an older brush that I've used a lot, and so it has lost its shape that it was intended to have. This is a round brush that was supposed to come to a point. Now I've used it to the point and cleaned it where it's now become frayed, and I can reshape it, and that's going to be another video at some point in the future. But for now, I actually like what it gives me. Sometimes you really need those brushes that are kind of roughed up a little bit. Think of it like a ballerina shoe. You need them to be kind of worn in a little bit. So here's a soft line, a hard line, a soft dot, and a hard dot. And I want to show you how the bristles look right now. Right there is almost perfect for whenever you are adding detail for trees or flowers, grass, because all you simply have to do is, now that it's in this shape and those bristles are separated the way that they are, you just lightly dip it in your color and then you just dab. This one is an older brush of mine as well. It is a flat brush and it has frayed a little bit at the ends, and that means they kind of stick out, but that's okay. Here is a soft line, a hard line, a soft dot, and a hard dot. Because it is a flat brush, I'm also going to show you the side angle as well. So here is a soft stroke, a hard stroke, a soft dot, and a hard dot. I'm going to work my way down this side. I want to utilize this piece of paper as much as possible. We've got one more in this category, and this is one of my stiffer brushes that keep their shape. The bristles are long and it is skinny, and it is a round brush. This brush in particular curves a little bit, if you can tell right here. It just kind of curls down, but I actually kind of like that. Here's a soft brush, a hard brush, a soft dot, and a hard dot. This brush I showed to you several times during the beginning portion of the video. This one, as you can clearly tell, is very well loved, very well used. This one I can dab and load the paint up as much as I want, and these are hard nylon bristles. They keep their shape phenomenally. The only reason why this one has lost its shape has been from using a really long time, and from the using and washing and it not being reconditioned the entirety of me having it. It has formed into this, but these bristles are very hard, and this type of brush is really good at keeping its shape, especially when it's brand new. Here's a soft line, a hard line, a soft dot, and a hard dot. Now I'm also going to show you, I messed up my hard dot, I apologize, or I messed up my soft dot. I will redo that, I apologize. Here's a soft dot, and you can clearly see that you get a lot of little dots. This is perfect for whenever you are adding color to landscapes. Last category that I have are these softer nylon brushes that do keep their shape really well, but they're not necessarily the same type of nylon as the other brush was. And I have yet to show you a fan brush other than the Sumi one, so I wanted to demonstrate one of these as well. I also want to point out that so far I have shown you brushes that have either a point or a flat edge. This one is actually angled. Here's a soft line, here's a hard line, soft dot, hard dot. Now from the side, here's a soft line, a hard line, a soft dot, and a hard dot. As you can see, this one kept its shape the longest, just like this brush did. Now the fan brush. Soft line, hard line, soft dot, hard dot. This one can give you 3 angles. I just gave you one. This angle is number 2. Soft line, hard line, soft dot, hard dot. Now, I'm barely going to have enough space to do the last bit here, but we're going to do it anyway. Soft brush, hard brush. I'm going to steal space from right here. Soft dot, hard dot. Doesn't that fan out so beautifully? Looking at it on a paper black and white, you can clearly see there are different brushes, but there are also a lot of similarities between several different brush types. You don't have to stick with just one, and there are many more different ways to use your brushes, obviously, other than making lines and dots. These are just what I demonstrated here. But you can see here that the lines and the dots speak for themselves in the different brush types that I showed you today. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Please comment on this video any questions that you have about brushes, or perhaps there's something you want me to cover in the future with my art tips. Perhaps your idea will be featured in one of my upcoming videos. Don't forget to like this video if you liked it. It really helps out my channel. And share it if it's something that you think your friends will find useful. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next time. Bye!